Last question from Professor Prantik Banerjee. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Do you see, in a curious twist of history, that the 1835 Macaulay Minute eventually came on to bite Macaulay's butt? Because, it was thanks to British education that a lot of subversive and anti British literature proliferated primarily from schools and colleges, the kind of campuses that you talked about. Do you see that happening? Fortunately for us, we keep blaming Macaulay, but you got to thank him hugely for making such acts of subversiveness possible in the very first instance. So it's like we ended up dismantling the master with his own tools, isn't it?
That's a wonderful observation, and I would absolutely agree with it. Which is why also I think it doesn't make sense to say that anything that is colonial is necessarily something which is, because by this time I think Swapna Little said it in her session that Indians are co-creating colonial modernity. By this time, we are using, as you very very rightly said, the tools that colonial rule gave us, and we are using it to dig the foundations of to destroy the foundations of colonial rule. So that's a very, very pertinent observation, I think. Yeah. Thank you.
Savari, and I welcome you all on the second day of Vidarbha Literary Festival 2024, where we bring the best of non-fiction authors to you and have prolific conversation with them. So our first session for the second day is Banned and Censored by Devika Sethi, and our moderator is Dr. Sachin Sadavarte. But before we get to the introduction of our moderator and our author, I would like to thank our sponsors because of whom VLF 2024 was possible. All right. So our moderator for this morning is Dr. Sachin Sadavarte. He is a practicing anesthesiologist. He is an avid reader and loves listening to music, and he also loves trekking. Well, that's all he sent about himself. Being so modest, he doesn't like to speak a lot about himself. But being a part of the same group that reviews non-fiction books every fortnightly called Book Adda, I know that he is a brilliant person. He has knowledge about many, many different fields and not just his own field. He reads a lot of books, and he's very friendly person to go to when you want to ask something. You're assured to get authentic and honest and true review about anything, especially books, from him. And Sachin sir, thank you so much for bringing so many of your friends, renowned doctors from the city. I see many beautiful smiling faces in the audience, which is a lovely thing to have this morning. Now I would like to introduce our author. We heard Devika ji yesterday in a wonderful panel discussion that we had. Devika Sethi is a professor of modern history at IIT Mandi in Himachal Pradesh. Her books War Over Words and Banned and Censored have gathered a lot of praise recently. She studied at St. Stephen's College in New Delhi, after which she completed her master's and doctorate from the Center of Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. She has also assisted in preparation of the NCERT history textbook for class 11. Devika ji is passionate about modern Indian history and decolonization studies, and her books explore the contemporary history of India and its journey to freedom that was withheld from the world. So, welcome our moderator and our author to the session. Before we start our session, I request everyone to please your mobile phones on silent mode and do not attend any calls during the session. If you must attend a call, there's exit behind you. So you can go in the lobby and attend your calls and come back. Thank you so much, and over to you, Sachin.
Thank you. Thank you for the lovely introduction, Asabri. Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to Devika on this cool, pleasant Sunday morning. By the way, Devika has traveled all the way from Mandi to be here with us. We are extremely honored to have you here,
Thank
Devika.
you.
So, the first question: why did you feel the need that today's reader should read the words of banned writers? Or maybe, in other words, when did this idea dawn upon you to write such a book?
So thank you for that. Good morning. Can you hear me at the back? I hope there's no echo. So, first of all, before I answer your very important question, I'd like to thank the organizers of the Vidarbha Literary Festival for putting together such a professional, competent, and yet friendly and warm kind of event. I was here all day yesterday, and it was a real pleasure. So, I'm looking forward to this session. I'm looking forward to your questions and to the questions of the audience. So, to answer your question, this is the book that we are discussing today. It's called Banned and Censored. And since this is the 75th year of the Indian Republic, I thought it would be a good idea to put together at least 75 items of texts, books, pamphlets, poems, excerpts from full-length books and so on that were banned by the British between 1900 and 1947. So that's what the book is about. The motivation for this book, I'll talk a little bit about my first book as well, because if I had not written my first book, which was written for an academic audience, I would not have been able to write the second one. So I'll talk about the two books. But the motivation came from a number of sources, because every historian is also a citizen. And as a citizen of India, you read the newspapers, you see the news. Sedition is in the news all the time, what is nationalism, what is anti-nationalism, and so on. So that was a contemporary concern, because if what Savarkar, Gandhi, Nehru, Bose, Tilak, all of these, SP Mukherjee, all of these people have in common is they may have differed, as you know, Gandhi, on their political views, but what they have in common is that all of them were censored by the British. And not only censored, they spent several years of their lives in jail, sometimes even outside India, for the crime of writing something, not for inciting violence or anything. So that was a contemporary concern that, this seditionists have got us our independence. And why were they banned? What is it that they said that was so dangerous for a state, this all-powerful colonial state that we think about? How can mere words on a piece of paper scare them so much that they have to send Tilak to,
Exactly.
exile him and so on? So that was one concern. The other concern was just curiosity. I think history is not always about finding prescriptions for the future or a guide to the future. It's sometimes just very interesting to know how people lived and thought 100 years ago or 5,000 years ago. 100 years ago is easier than 5,000 years. So that was curiosity. Those were the two main drivers. The other thing that interests me very much as a teacher of history, as a professional historian, is diversity of views among Indian nationalists, because we see that among our politicians today. And it's fascinating to see how, for example, this issue of non-violence and violence. So when Bhagat Singh and his comrades are executed in 1931, there's a lot of literature in multiple languages. My book covers banned literature in 10 languages. I'll talk about that more.
We'll come to that later.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was what happens when Bhagat Singh is executed? How is the Congress going to react to it? Why are Congress pamphlets from that time banned? Because they are often seen to be at loggerheads with each other. So all these are diverse motivations for writing this book.
Okay. And how did you come up with the brilliant title of the book? Or was it an obvious choice?
Okay, I'll share a secret. Academics are very safe and boring people. So I came up with a very dull, safe title, which was Proscribed Writings from Colonial India. And the publisher of this book is Rowley. They are excellent with their marketing. And they realize that they have to be the bridge between an academic writer and the general audience, because this book is very much for people like you.
That's
you know?
very true. That's
So
very
it's for an audience who would spend their Sunday morning listening to a historian rather than, relaxing at home. So it was written for an audience like you in mind. And the publisher, Mr. Pramod Kapoor, is the person who came up with this very jazzy, subtitle, which is what the British Raj didn't want you to read. And of course, all of us are curious about things that we are forbidden from doing. So I think, the marketing genius of the publishers has to be credited for the title. I would have gone for a very safe, boring title.
Before we elaborate on the book for the audience, those who haven't read, are there any top 3 kind of articles? Can you label 3 top articles or texts or poems which were kind of shocking revelations when you were studying the book, when you were preparing the book?
Sure. So what I'd like to do, I'll take the liberty. We have excellent support with the PowerPoint there. I'd like to showcase some of the material I have in the book. The material is mainly written texts. There are some images, but just to generate a little bit of interest, this is the kind of stuff that we are talking about that was banned. And I just want to talk a little bit about the processes of retrieving this stuff, because all of this is buried in government files usually. Some of these books are still in print, but a lot of the pamphlets and so on, when the British banned anything, they actually had to justify the ban. You know, the senior officers would have their discussions and so on. They would have to report it sometimes even to the British Parliament. So whatever they thought was objectionable, that was kept in a file with detailed commentary, almost like book reviews or poetry reviews. Often it had to be translated. So Tilak is translated by an official, you know, the articles in Kesari in 1897, 1908, they are translated by an official Marathi-speaking, Marathi native translator. And only then is it decided that, you know, whether it's going to be banned or not. So the historian has access to that material. I want to share some of that with you. So if we could just go to, now this I want to show you. This is, I'll just explain what this is. This is a speech that Nehru makes. Nehru spends about 9 years of his life in jail for speeches and, you know, material that was deemed to be seditious. But this piece, what happens is, this is from 1932. He makes a speech. I'll explain what it is. You may not have the time to read all of it, but on the left side, there's a spy in the audience. There's an official spy in the audience. He is kind of, you know, transcribing what Nehru is saying. Basically, Nehru is talking about Bhagat Singh. He is appreciating Bhagat Singh's supreme sacrifice, 1931, but he's trying to say that the Congress still does not support violence. That's basically what he's saying. So that's the, you know, that's the transliteration. It's in Roman alphabet, but it's actually Hindi. So for example, it says, Pandit ji ne bataya ki kis prakar wo ladke itna vikhyat, and so on. On the right side is the translation into English, which British officials could understand, and then they would decide whether this speech was worth prosecuting or not. You know, and this speech, you know, he did go to jail for this speech as well. So clearly they thought it was, you know, not a good thing. So this is just a sample of the kind of stuff that historians find in their files. Can we go to the next one, please? Now this is a postcard. These are all excerpts from the book, by the way. So this is a postcard. You would have all heard of Bhikaiji Kama, Madam Bhikaiji Kama. And she is based in Paris, and a lot of NRIs are involved in the freedom struggle at this time. And they are sending postcards, they are sending pamphlets, they are sending all this material from California, from Paris, from London, and so on. I'm going to talk about Savarkar in a minute. And, you know, this is one of the postcards. It would not have been sent in as a postcard, because obviously then people can see what it is. It would have been put in an envelope and mailed, maybe mass mailed to, let's say, universities and so on. So it says here on the left, in my book, it's kind of straightened, resistance to tyranny is obedience to God. So very powerful message, and this is a banned postcard. And what I've done in my book is, I've included some of the banned material, but more importantly, I've done the detective work to explain to my readers why that material was banned, how it was caught, what was the penalty, and so on. Can we go to the next one? Now this is again very interesting. It's called the Oath of a Sepoy. You must have heard of the Gadar party, the Gadar movement and so on, 1913 onwards. And one big problem that Indian nationalists have is that, and this is again something which is a little unconventional, that millions of Indians are volunteering for the British Army. Any guesses as to how many Indian men volunteered for the British Army in 1914, First World War? Any guesses in terms of thousands, lakhs? Can you guess? Like 10,000, 2 lakhs? A random number. I'm looking for a random number. 20 lakhs is a little high, but so it's about 1.3 million, which is 13 lakhs, closer to your figure. Second World War, 2.5 million Indian men volunteer for the British, and this is a volunteer army. Nobody is forcing them. They are inducements. They get land, they get a pension, they get that vardi, whatever. So the big thing, the big challenge that parties like the Gadar party have to do is to kind of tell these soldiers that you need to leave your allegiance, you know. So 1913 onwards, they are sending all this material, and the British are panicking. You know, there's the Royal Indian Mutiny in 1946, which also puts them in a state of panic and which kind of hastens our independence.
Naval mutiny.
The naval mutiny. The Royal Naval Mutiny. And this, you know, again, these are just samples. I don't have the time to read all of it, but, you know, very beautiful sentiments, you know, fight for the sake of your country, do not fear. It is a glorious thing to die fighting. Hindus are bound by oath on the Ved and Granth, and Musalmans by oath on the Quran to fight against the Firangis. Whoever fails is a shameless son of the devil, brothers. So again, appeal to religion, appeal to religious unity. That is something I found in many of the banned texts, that Hindus and Muslims put aside your differences and fight this common enemy and so on. So that's just another sample. The next one. Again, this is from Yugantar, a Bengali journal that you would have heard of, which is banned, 1907. And just look at the symbols. Again, that Hindu-Muslim unity, the symbols of both religions. So much of the stuff is visual. And the British don't really know how to handle it, because just having a flag with a sword and a trident and the symbols, how do you say that it is seditious? I'll also talk about strategies for evading censorship in a bit. Can we go to the next one? This answer will take a bit of time, but then it'll make it easier for me to explain the other stuff. 1857, 1908 was the 50th anniversary. Savarkar organized a major function in London. He wrote a kind of a pamphlet which he sent to India. It was also intercepted and so on. So these are the kind of things that we are looking at. Can we go to the next one, please? This I find fascinating. You asked about my 3 favorites, and I'm showing so much stuff. This is not even a paper. This is a dhoti, a band dhoti. Can you imagine a band? So this is from Bengal. There was a lot of political assassination by students. There are students in the room, so I hope you'll not get any ideas. But there's a lot of political assassination by students, particularly from Bengal.
Sorry to interrupt you. Why there was so much movement in Bengal in early 1900? Was there any incidents which prompted the Bengalis to, take arms in their hands?
So Bengal and Maharashtra both, actually, these are the 2 centers of radicalism. Part of it, so for Bengal, the explanation is, of course, the partition of Bengal and so on. For Maharashtra, the regions that are today, for Pune and so on, I have read a very interesting explanation, which is that, when the British take over power from the Mughals, they are actually defeating the Marathas, not the Mughals, because the Mughals are ruling only in name. So a lot of Marathas actually feel that it is they who are the rightful inheritors of Mughal authority, not the British. So that's another reason, you feel that you were about to get the throne and somebody else has stolen it from you. So that's one reason. But yeah, I'm sure from your history textbooks, you'll remember non-cooperation, civil disobedience, quit India, all these movements. And the stuff I'm showing you here is kind of behind those movements. It is prompting those movements as well. So if you see here, such powerful lines you find in this writing. It's not intended to be literature, but a lot of it is very literary. One bomb can kill a man. There are a lack of bombs in our homes. Mother, what can the English do? This is, in the voice of a person who has been executed for throwing a bomb. And again, a dhoti. And, in the government file, a thick file, there was a lot of debate that should we ban a dhoti, because this was printed on the border of the... Just like 1857, chapatis are supposed to have been coded carriers of messages. So here you have... And this just shows that when you have a people determined to break free from shackles, they will use all sorts of methods. Next, please. Again, as I said, I've used material from variety of languages. The first excerpt is from 1905. The last is from the mid-1940s. And this is a poem in Hindi. Again, the same, we are madmen, give us the shackles of iron. Ornaments of gold, don't try to induce us through material, by giving us salaries and so on. Now we are determined to break free. Hindus and Muslims have united. Next, please. I want to show some images. It's a genre called the Bhagat Singh martyrology posters. Because,
Bhagat Singh plays a major role in your book.
Yes.
The literature around him, the people worshipping, praying for him, that has played a major role in your book.
Yes. I'm really grateful to Sachin because he has done a very careful reading of my book. And that really, for a historian, the best thing is when historians read your work, because then you know that it's filtering into the larger public. That's why I also like teaching in an IIT as opposed to teaching in a history department.
I was about to come to that. How easy or difficult it was to teach, rather it is to teach engineering minds history. Mm-hmm. Because, so what is your experience? How difficult, easy or different it is to teach history to engineering students in IIT?
Actually, in some ways it is... in some ways it is challenging because there's a lot of received wisdom that they have, which they have to unlearn just to be open. Like this question I asked you about the World War. We all think that every Indian was anti-British, and 20th century is that, and of course that becomes true by the 40s. But you also have a lot of, and one of the things I tell my students is that rather than rush to judge that a soldier who worked for the British in the Second World War, rather than joining the INA, is a traitor to the country. Try and understand the INA's motivation, understand that soldiers' motivation. So I think that is the challenge, because all of us as humans are too quick to judge. Understanding takes a lot of time.
Tend to judge things very easily.
Very easily,
And
and
we don't
that's
know the context
easier.
in which all these things were happening 100 years ago.
Absolutely. So if you see this poster, there are many, many posters like this. There is some divine element usually from the Hindu pantheon, which is blessing. There is a kind of a Bharat Mata, and there are all these martyrs who are giving their heads, and many of these posters were banned. Now, one thing which I also want to highlight is the literacy rate in India in 1931 is about 10%. So it's not as if everybody is going to be able to read all the stuff. I'll talk about why even that 10% wields a disproportionate influence. But if you see a poster like this, you don't have to be literate. Bhagat Singh's topi tells you it is Bhagat Singh, because you've seen that topi everywhere. And when you see a poster like this, you immediately know what is happening and what has happened. So in a country where literacy rates are low, visual imagery is important. Can we go to the next one? I think I just have a couple more. Just to give you an example, this is what rattles repressive regimes. I thought that was important to showcase. Can we go to the next one? I've also given the source. Again, this is not even a text or a poem or a pamphlet. It's just a writing pad. This man's image is scaring this, immense colonial state into banning they think it's not safe for people to have a writing pad with
To have a
Bhagat
look
Singh.
at even his photograph.
Yes, and that is the power of, yeah. This is, I think, the last image I wanted to show you. Again, would be of interest for authors from the next session, where, it says, our liberator Subhash Babu Zindabad, Azad Hind Zindabad, Hamara Taranhar. And again, something which is banned. Nothing. There's no violence, there's no suggestion of anything, but people's images become dangerous at one point. So this is the kind of material that you have in the book, with context notes, some detective work, and some explanations. This I'll talk about later. Yeah, I think I'll just talk about it a bit later.
While I was reading this book, I was wondering, you have written in the introduction of the book itself that such material ultimately is confined to the dustbin of history. Do you really think it holds true today, when people like you are taking so much efforts to show this material the day of light?
So I'd again like to ask the audience a question. I'm sure you were aware that the British are banning stuff, but were you aware of what kind of stuff they were banning? Maybe you were aware of Inqilab Zindabad or Sarfaroshi Ki Tamanna and all that. But were you aware that of exactly what kind of stuff was being banned? Images, writing pads, dhotis, what kind of poems? Calendar art, of course. Calendar art has been written about by several historians. But this anthology is actually the first anthology, surprisingly. There have been anthologies on Bhagat Singh alone. So all the material on Bhagat Singh's execution that was banned. But this
That way
is
your
the...
book stands out, because
Yes.
it has included many unsung heroes.
Yes.
Like while reading the book, you realize there were so many people who have done so many things fearlessly. I mean, just to give an example, the annual household earning at that time was 100 rupees per year annual, and these people were penalized for 500, 1,000 and 2,000 rupees. Their press, their material were confiscated, but still people were fighting for their freedom. So you have given them a face or a name through your book. What a commendable
Yes,
job.
that was exactly the thing, because I think what happens is we all tend to focus on the usual characters, who are also represented in the book, by the way. I've mentioned the names of nationalist leaders that we're familiar with. Some of this material was also anonymous, so one doesn't know who composed it. I should add one thing though, not everything that was banned needs to be celebrated. That's something that as a historian I'm cautious about, because very often it can be very racist. They would say the British are pigs and the British are this, and it can be very hate filled. It would qualify as hate speech, and so on. It can also be very cliched in a way that, characterizing women as weak and men as strong, and, oh, men, will you not save your women from death and destruction? So today we find those things a bit retrogressive. not everything needs to be celebrated. So I had to really pick and choose stuff that I thought was representative of the linguistic diversity, regional diversity, novelty of themes, and so on also.
Do you really think that, as you said, the literacy rate was just 10%? Do you really think that ban was effective or was it needed, given the tyrannical rule that Britishers were having in the early 19th century? So was it really needed to ban such material? Were they so much scared?
Yeah. See, one of the things that I've also done, and I'm sure many of you would like to read or have read biographies and autobiographies of nationalist leaders. In the Teen Murti Library, in the Nehru Memorial Library in Delhi, they used to record testimonies of freedom fighters from all parts of India, starting from the 1980s onwards. And now they are transcribed, so you can read the audio recording. And there you find most of them say that they were radicalized as students in colleges and universities, just going to the library and picking up books by even Irish nationalists and books about the French Revolution and so on. So once you see that, you realize that the printed word actually did have a lot of influence on radical nationalism. I would add to that in the short term, censorship was definitely successful. You would be familiar with the term called the chilling effect. As you said, if I'm put in jail for something I say, or you're put in jail for something you
So
write,
for the time being, you can suppress
nobody
them.
else in the room is going to write that stuff. So censorship definitely has a chilling effect in the short term. But in the long term, 75 years later, the British are long gone, and we are still discussing these immortal words. So in a sense, they have defeated censorship, right, in the long run. And that's why this book. It's the victory in a sense of expression over repression in the long term, maybe not in the short term.
So according to you, the anti-national publicists, anti-national nationalists were successful in their endeavor?
See, that's a difficult question, because if I say that we got independence because Tilak was prosecuted for the Kesari or because Nehru spent 9 years in jail,
But
that is...
gradually it must have built up that.
Yes, absolutely. I think it radicalized the Indian public to a great extent. And what happens, again, the question about literacy, that India, as you know, has always been a culture that greatly respects orality also. So you might have one reader of a newspaper in the village, but he could, explain things to the rest of the village. He would have that, once the radio comes, the Azad Hind Fauj broadcasts into India from various places also. So you don't need necessarily to be literate to have access to these ideas. Other people can be your translators, even if you're not literate.
Okay. And when you are preparing such book, how easy or difficult it is to get this primary source material, and plus this must be in different languages.
Yes.
All the regional languages must be in Bengali, Marathi, or in other languages. So how easy or difficult it was to get this material and get it translated and compile it into an English book?
So Sachin, the reason why nobody has ventured on a project like this before me is because the problem is not that you don't find material. Often historians will tell you, how do we write about the Harappan period, because we don't know the script, we don't know. In this case, the problem is the British censored so much. I'll just give you one. Nobody has been able to compile a comprehensive list. But between 1907 and 1947, 10,000 individual titles, individual books, individual journals, individual magazines, individual newspapers were censored, and so on. So it's a large number. Fortunately, the British were also great at documenting, not because they wanted us to discuss this 75 years, 80 years later, but because they wanted to keep a precedent for later. So that if somebody contested their prosecution, they would say, see, in 1921 we prosecuted for. And today, all those records are there. Not always easy to access. They are there in the National Archives of India. They are there in the British Library. I've used libraries in the US and in Germany as well. So I collected stuff from all over the place. Translation is again a very interesting question. I'll give you an example from Tilak's trial. I guess that would be of interest, particularly to an audience here. So the trial in 1908, he was sentenced to 6 years after that, of rigorous imprisonment, and transportation. But Tilak, it was a jury trial at that time, and Tilak argues for 5 days in the courtroom
I
himself.
think he argued for himself.
For himself,
Yeah.
yes.
He put
20 hours.
No, 20 hours.
And he argues even with the official translator. So just imagine Mr. Joshi is on one side, Tilak is on the other side. And he's telling him that, why have you translated vadh, the term vadh, as murder? And why not as, let's say, more in a spiritual, philosophical sense, as, righteous assassination or something like that, you know. So small things are important. Official translators, of course, would translate things in a way that they would make the culprit, or the not the culprit, the accused, look the worst. So they would take, so you know, another thing that Tilak tells him is that I said, you know, in Marathi I had said that the British are blind with arrogance, and you have said that they are drunk with arrogance. They are very different, you know, implication becomes
meaning
different.
changes, meaning
Yes.
changes.
So what I've done is, from the Hindi I have been able to translate myself, but for the other languages I have relied on colonial translations, but which are there in, you know, either the files or in other newspapers and so on. But I do mention in the book that that seemed a good decision to me, because in a sense I wanted also to show what is scaring the colonial state, and what is scaring the colonial state is the translation that they themselves have commissioned. So that is what enabled me to use. So there's, you know, there's Urdu, Punjabi, Marathi, Gujarati, Odia, English, Hindi, of course. So lots of languages represented there.
Now we know in the history there were moderates and there were revolutionaries. They had their different ideologies, different modus operandi. So is the material also it's the same? Like moderates writing material and the revolutionaries writing, was it similar or different?
I'm really glad you're asking these questions, because you're allowing me to, you know, really open up the book for the audience. So thank you for that. See, that is another thing that you see, that we think nationalists are all one color, you know, but that's not obviously the case. You have, as I said, there's so much of a difference between a Gandhi and a Bhagat Singh and a Subhash Bose and so on. And that diversity of views you find here. You know, often you find, for example, you know, I have an excerpt from Bose's banned book also. That's the last excerpt in the book. And that was banned in 1935. And there he's saying that I disagree with Gandhian methods, but I have the greatest of respect for Gandhi. And now the British would have liked to have censored only part of it, right? They would have liked to have censored only the part where he says, I have the greatest of respect for Gandhi. But Gandhian methods, they would have liked to have, you know, overplayed those differences. But when you ban something, you put the entire thing out of circulation. So I'm hoping that you'll also get a very vivid flavor of just the sheer diversity of opinion that characterized anti-colonial nationalists. You know, they're not thinking the same at all.
And when you write on history, how do you handle controversies? Because, for example, there is a controversy when Bhagat Singh, Sukhdev, and Rajguru were about to be executed. One set of historians says that Gandhiji did not do anything to,
Right.
you know, avoid their execution. And historians like you have mentioned in the book that Gandhiji took some efforts to put up their case against, in front of the viceroy. So when these things where there is a kind of ambiguity among historians, so how as a historian you come up with something and mention in black and white?
Yeah. So see, as I said yesterday in a panel discussion also, history is an evidence-based discipline. It is not an opinion-based discipline, which it tends to become at times. So if you have the evidence, you show whatever letter you have. If you don't believe what I'm saying, you get me another letter. Of course, there is the question of interpretation. Like this word, I just gave you one example. You know, one word can be interpreted in a mystical, spiritual kind of way, and it can be interpreted as a call to murder. So obviously there's a difference of opinion, but I think evidence is something which historians do go on. And I think, see, historians also have a responsibility to write responsibly. I am not on social media for other reasons. I have never been on social media, but I think increasingly there is a tendency to simplify things and put them in social media just to grab eyeballs and to get people to read your book by saying something which is very controversial. So there is that trend as well, and I think if you avoid that, then people might actually take your work more seriously.
And even not just British, anti-British, even you have mentioned the rifts or differences that were there in the Indians.
Yes.
Like when Swatantra Veer Savarkar sent his pamphlet to India, I think you have mentioned that Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya was amongst the prominent personalities who requested the Britishers to ban it.
Yes.
So what I feel while reading this book is when you write something, you need to have very solid evidence.
Yes.
So as a historian, what efforts are needed to put such things into writing?
So actually we can see thank you, we can see now this is something that really startled me, because it was not a surprise for me that Savarkar was sending material to India that was banned, and he's a very, very powerful writer. In 1908 he is at the India House, he writes this, he's the author, it's not mentioned here, but he is the author of this pamphlet called O Martyrs. It's a long pamphlet, I've reproduced the entire thing in my book, where he's saying that it's the 50th anniversary of 1857 and we should again unite. And he mentions Begum Hazrat Mahal, he mentions Rani of Jhansi and various other things. Now this pamphlet is posted, so what they would do is either they would send entire sets of pamphlets to schools and colleges in closed covers, or they would send them to influential people, posing as letters and so on. And if you see the next one, in the archives, I found this letter, which I have also reproduced, where Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya is writing to the Chief Secretary of the United Provinces after receiving this pamphlet, complaining that, all this poisonous, all this poisonous material is coming into India and it needs to be banned. This is there in the book. So again, it makes you question, what is really going on here, because, both are associated with the Hindu Mahasabha later, and you're wondering what is going on here, but that's the evidence. And that brings me to another point. I'm not trying to say here that Malviya is not somebody we should appreciate, but all I'm trying to say is that the censors in India, that's one of the key takeaways from both my books actually, that censors in India are not necessarily the British only. I'll give you one example. By 1937, that's 10 years before independence, there are about 1900 ICS officials in India that are European, British, and about 1300 Indian ICS officers. So increasingly, as I looked at my government files, I found that the ban notifications were signed by Indian officials, Mr. Mathur, Mr. Sharma, Mr. Joshi,
Indians
and
were
so on.
contributing to the
Absolutely. So this whole idea that and Malviya incidentally himself was banned in 1932 for a statement that he
was
made, and I've
interesting.
included that.
That
So the censored of one generation become the censors of the next generation. I've shown that in my first book. I'll just show you my first book. It's called War Over Words, Censorship in India 1930-60, Cambridge University Press. This was written for more academic audience, but I was very interested in the 1950s and why is it that we retain sedition in our constitution and so on. So that's where this book is coming from. But so you find these fascinating. In Shama Prasad Mukherjee is also, he's also a victim of censorship. Because he's also the finance minister in the Bengal government in 1942. But one of the things that he's writing to the governor of Bengal is that if you want to put the Congress down, the Congress movement down, start recruiting Bengalis in the army. So create a force of 1 lakh Bengalis. So again, historians who go to the archives with an open mind, find all sorts of interesting stuff in the archives. Yeah.
You have included 75 articles. There are 75 articles right from 1905 to 1946. So what happened in those last 50 years? Because the 1857 mutiny was suppressed by the Britishers. Then then came the time of 50 years. What exactly happened in the first half of 20th century when so much material came into force?
So as you know, the Congress is founded in 1885, but it's for the first 15-20 years, it's a very mild, discussion group, book club almost, it's not really doing anything very much. But as I said, due to political decisions that are made, also, you have to understand the international context. The Russian Revolution in 1917, 1905, Japan, which was considered at that time to be a poor country, defeated the Russian Navy, and that really lit a spark among many anti-colonial nationalist movements.
Even Irish freedom movement had a lot of influence.
Yes, so there are those influences, there are decisions that the British are taking in India. And of course, see, the printing press came to India in 1550. So about 100 years after, Europe. So there is, print culture was very well established by this time. There are societies, there are organizations. In 1905, there are 2 million subscribers in India of newspapers and journals. That's a large number, 20 lakh people in a country with a literacy rate of, and mind you, any one newspaper, as we know, is not read just by one person. It's read by the whole household or the whole village.
By the way, today it's 28th January and happens to be the birth anniversary of Lala Lajpat Rai. So his killing was effective or instrumental in doing some movement when he was brutally killed in Lahore. So was that one of the factors that also prompted? Because we have read in the history that Bhagat Singh was probably took up the oath to fight for the freedom.
That's absolutely right. Jallianwala Bagh is one such flashpoint, 1919. Lala Lajpat Rai's killing attributed to police action is another. So there are these flashpoints, but actually India was on the boil. There were some years when it was more silent, maybe due to repression, but from about 1900 to 1947, the British find it very difficult to. But as I said, the loyalty of the armed forces is something that they count on, and that's why the Gadar party, they really, or the INA, they really lose it when that is threatened.
You have mentioned in the book that some of the anti-colonial censorship laws are still in place. So, as a historian, do you feel that these laws need a relook in today's context?
See, one of the things that one learns when one studies censorship is that everything does not need to be stated in a very obvious, obvious way. Because a lot of people are able to evade censorship in this. The first thing that I use is from a Marathi journal called Bhal, in which Bhala, sorry, in which. It's an allegory where I don't have the time to read all of it now, but it's an allegory that, where, and of course it was penalized, where the writer says that once the king of hell had a darbar to choose that who will be my successor, and lots of kings came and so on, and finally the person who won was white-faced, wearing a red hat.
He described Britisher in a different
way, and then he says that, and then this guy said that, I have ruined so many people and homes, and I've stolen money.
Nobody can beat the atrocities which I have doing on a nation.
Absolutely. So now see, that is kind of a way of saying that it's the British, but in his defense, when the case went to court, this guy said, see, I've not mentioned British anywhere. I've just mentioned that, a fair person with a red hat and so on. So one of the things that censorship teaches you is that if I want to talk about sedition today, I don't need to talk about present day cases. I can show you examples from the past as well. And,
you can tweak those laws.
Yes.
If you don't want to get censored.
Yes. You can tweak those laws, but see, as far as the laws are concerned, I think as concerned citizens, we should all be wondering why we still have sedition. And in fact, in the new criminal laws that we've just got, it's not me, it's the famous Supreme Court lawyer Colin Gonsalves who said that those laws are 10 times worse than colonial laws. So it's for us, 3 years of imprisonment versus 7 years. The more vague a sedition law is, see, I'm very clear. I've been studying censorship since 2005. So it's something that I'm, various aspects of it. My third book is also going to be a primer on free speech. But so I do feel that, see, I'm often asked, do we need any censorship laws as well? Because there are certain scholars who say that it's a slippery slope. If you have any censorship, you can always keep on expanding the ambit. And my answer to that is that I definitely think in India we need hate speech laws. We need laws that criminalize, speech that incites hatred among communities, however defined, caste, class, religion, region, gender, sexuality, whatever. But I see with sedition, what is the thing? The thing is that you are saying that the state is threatened by its citizens. And that seems a very unequal kind of contest to me, that, the state can be, citizens can definitely threaten each other. In fact, if you look at our constitution, the founding fathers of our constitution take it as a given that the constitution is protecting Indians from other Indians, abolition of untouchability, various other equality. But to have a law that protects the state from its citizens seems irrelevant to me. Hate speech, I think, needs to be controlled and legislated. Yeah.
How much time did it require to finish this book? Because your first book came in 19 and
Yes.
your second book came in 22. So how much time did it require to finish this book?
See, if I say 20 years, I won't look very good. But actually, it's a project, as I said, when I was doing the first book was a study of law, policy, and so on. So I couldn't include this flavorful material in that book. So I was going on collecting it. I didn't know where it would go. But Mr. Kapoor of Roli Books is the one who approached me. And he said that, see, people are interested in knowing why Tilak went to jail. Why did Gandhi go to jail? Why did Nehru go to jail? Why did Savarkar go to jail? And so on. So why don't you try? And it was I said I'll do it in a year, because I had a lot of the material, but it was actually very difficult. It took me the last 4-5 years, I've been working on this, because see, finding a banned poem, book, pamphlet, newspaper is not at all difficult, as I said. But selecting 75 pieces and more importantly, giving context, so that people understand, that entails, I had to look at newspapers, I had to look at government files, that entailed, the pandemic came, but some of the stuff is digitized. So it was harder than I thought it would be actually.
Any noteworthy incident when you were researching for the book? Something you would like to remember, mention?
I suppose just for as for all of us, the pandemic, because in a sense that forced us to do things in new ways and so on. Other than that, I've already mentioned. When I found this letter by Malviya, I was really shocked. So you have the archives have these gems, and you kind of react to that.
Who's your favorite author?
I am very, very fond as a historian of an author called Ramchandra Guha that many of you would have heard of. And I'll tell you why I like him. Because anybody who has worked with primary sources, not other people's ideas, but with the real material, knows that to write it up in a way that is interesting is very difficult. Collecting the material is okay. When I read any Ramchandra, first of all, he's pioneered a lot of genres in India. He's pioneered the history of cricket, the history of the environment. He's done biographies. When everybody thought nobody can write anything new on Gandhi, he went to South Africa and found a new archive. Having said that, so if you look at his notes, they are impeccable, thick, well researched. The reason I like him is when I read a Ramchandra Guha book or an article, it reminds me of a duck on water, where the duck is looking so smooth, but below it's kind of paddling like mad. He makes it look easy. And if you've written a work of history or a novel, or if you've written anything, a college assignment, a report, you would know how difficult the act of writing it is. So to do good research and to make it, bedtime reading is actually very difficult. So I really admire him as a historian.
And what time, like what you do, or how do you write? At what time of the day?
Yeah.
Is it early morning, late night, or whenever it strikes your mind? That is first question. And what do you do when you don't write, when you're not writing?
So, okay, let me tell you something. I have no husband, no children, no pets, and I'm not on social media. So,
we have
you
a lot
can
of time.
imagine. I should have.
So you don't have any distraction as such.
It's the biggest privilege. In order of importance. So, as a result, I should have written 20 books by now. Because, I clearly
You'll
have
write
nothing
in
going
due
on.
course of time. You'll write 20 books.
But I
Sure.
hope so. But what I'm trying to say is that I really appreciate women particularly who have very busy lives and still manage to find the time. I am a college teacher, however, so that does take up some time. I tend to write very early in the morning, read and write.
You're an early morning person.
Early morning person, but I also have to confess one thing that we have at least 2 students from school who I'm very happy to see here. Like most of us, I kind of tend to miss deadlines, and I tend to do the work closer to the deadline rather than work in a very systematic way. So that I
Just
should.
one last question.
Yeah.
Are you working on your third book?
Yes, so that is being commissioned by a publisher. It's a primer on free speech. It'll be like a textbook for maybe college students, journalism students, and that's forcing me also to look at the philosophy of free speech issues. It's a deeply philosophical topic, not just the history. So that's the third book, and I'm hoping to work on it. Once again, before we end, I think we'll also have some questions
Yeah,
from the audience. I'd once again like to thank the organizers of VLF because I have really very much enjoyed this.
Good you all.
Writing is a very solitary activity, and to be here with all of you means a lot. Thank you.
So now we open the forum to the audience. Just one request: keep your questions relevant to the book, relevant to the history.
We'll go 1, 2, 3. He was the
Yeah. First.
Great conversation which you heard. Thank you.
Thank you.
One, how you can make yourself neutral, because when you will look at here of Newtonian historians, especially Mr. Mathur, all those things, and even Ramchandra Guha is somewhere on that side. How do you know they are right and they are wrong, or what been fed for so many years was right? Secondly, personal allegiance to particular parties can make it look particular way,
Yes.
like moderators and the revolutionaries. So how we look at history now, and probably 10 years down the line, if the current political dispensation stays on, so who was right and who was wrong? Because we are confused as a generation, what we read in the books, what been fed now, and what was right. So can you go on?
Thank you for that. Thank you for that very important question. See, for a long time it was believed that historians can be perfectly objective. This was the belief that you are a blank sheet and you just find the evidence and you record it and that's it. Nobody believes that to be true anywhere. Even the topics that we choose reflect our own. So, and as I said, we are also citizens. So obviously, I have a political viewpoint. The way I can be honest to my discipline is by, for example, in this book, if you see, on the back cover, I've just mentioned some of the more prominent names. I have Tilak, I have Savarkar, I have Malviya, I have Mukherjee. I also have Nehru, Motilal Nehru, Jayaprakash Narayan, Gandhi. So what I'm trying to say is that it is possible to be as fair as possible to your sources in terms of inclusion and exclusion. That's one thing. It's you may have a political viewpoint, but I think no historian should become the spokesperson of any political party on any side of the spectrum, because then you are kind of not doing justice to your discipline. That's one thing. You can also showcase your own viewpoint, because after all we are also analyzing the material. But I think it has to be done in a responsible way. Regarding this history, at IIT Mandi, I'm teaching two courses at the moment which I developed. One is the history of partition. The other is India in the 1950s. And as you can imagine, both are very, very sensitive topics, and it's difficult. And the way I try to balance it out is by having readings from, if I have a reading from Ramchandra Guha, I'll also include, let's say, a Hindol Sen Gupta who has written a biography of Patel. And I let the students decide. Doesn't mean I don't prefer one over the other, but I would say that one of the challenges of being a historian today is I get very depressed when I see this polarization. In that, if you praise Nehru, you can't praise Patel, and if you praise Patel, then you have to be anti-Nehru and so on. And I don't see it like that at all. So that would be an answer. But at least the consolation I have is that everybody is so interested in history. Almost all the debates that we have today, from Ayodhya to anything that you can think of, are grounded in history. And that is such a great opportunity for everybody who's interested in writing history, because there's so much interest in what you write. See, if you're a professional historian not affiliated to any political party, then it really doesn't matter who if you are. So I am in a government job, okay, my salary, but I don't think my salary is coming from the government, it's coming from the Indian state. Just like if you get a Bharat Padma Bhushan, it is coming from the Indian state, not from the current government in power. So I think if you have that attitude, it really doesn't matter to your work, but if you get involved in a kind of politics of patronage, when you are asking something from the government, then of course you have to toe the line, and that has been done in India in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. Currently, there's no change there.
Yeah, next
Yeah,
question.
my compliments to you for writing on very difficult and interesting topic. The paradox is, more you try to hide or suppress something, more interest it creates.
Yes.
So Britishers were trying to hide and censor all this material. What do you think, and did you get any reference about, did it prove counterproductive to British government, hiding and suppressing all these things? Did you find any documentation suggesting that?
Yes. So if you read memoirs, for example, if you read Vijay Lakshmi Pandit's memoir, Nehru's sister, she talks about how in their house they used to hide all these pamphlets, and so many other people have written about that also. So women would be hiding it under their blankets and pillows and saris and so on. So obviously it generated much more interest. And as I said, there are many strategies for evading censorship. So one thing that they would do is, if a pamphlet was banned, another pamphlet would include parts of that banned pamphlet as a quote, and maybe it would even say, we do not endorse this view, but you are still so definitely it was certainly counterproductive, because it increased people's curiosity to read the material.
Yeah, next question.
Congratulations on the brilliant concept, and I really respect authors who have researched so much and written. You have stirred up a lot of enthusiasm amongst the crowd. Most of the people in this room are our generation, whose maybe grandfathers or grandparents or parents were, alive, and they have seen the scenario for themselves when it was happening. But what do you wish to achieve from this? What do you expect the new generation, the younger generation, to learn from it?
From this book?
Yes, from the book.
See, part of it is just to see, because I've actually, for every excerpt that I've included the penalty that that author had to face, whether it was monetary penalty, whether it was imprisonment, whether it was exile, whatever it was. So one thing is just to value the freedoms that we have. I think we are so busy complaining about the state of the country and so on that we don't really understand what it took and what it meant when you were forbidden from entering a club or a park or a road or a temple or whatever it was. So I think that is something which is, just to value our freedom. And as I said, diversity of views and a certain respect for diversity of views is something that I also want to, because, we think that political differences were born in our time and all the nationalist leaders were on the same page. And it's only today that there is so much, whether it's the US, for example, or India. But when you see this, you see there is a lot of difference, but it is respectful. So that first thing that I showed you when Nehru is giving a speech about Bhagat Singh and he's trying to reconcile that this is a person who has indulged in a violent act, so you cannot endorse him fully, but you can still salute his bravery. And in the end, he reconciles it by saying, I wish all of us could die for our motherland. So he reconciles that instead of saying we should kill British, because that he cannot say. So I think that would be very interesting, that how you can have, and I am a big fan of the Constituent Assembly debates, which are all online. You can see how our constitution was framed. And you see the respect with which people put their views, very divergent views, on cow slaughter, Hindi language, and the respect, the humor, the erudition, the examples. And it's really, so I think if it's inspirational, that would be fantastic.
Yeah.
Last question from Professor Prantik Banerjee. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Do you see, in a curious twist of history, that the 1835 Macaulay Minute eventually came on to bite Macaulay's butt? Because, it was thanks to British education that a lot of subversive and anti-British literature proliferated primarily from schools and colleges, the kind of campuses that you talked about. Do you see that happening? Which, fortunately for us, we keep blaming Macaulay, but you got to thank him hugely for making such acts of subversiveness possible in the very first instance. So it's like, we ended up dismantling the master with his own tools, isn't it?
That's a wonderful observation, and I would absolutely agree with it, which is why also I think it doesn't make sense to say that anything that is colonial is necessarily something which is, because by this time I think Swapna Little said it in her session, that Indians are co-creating colonial modernity by this time. We are using, as you very, very rightly said, the tools that colonial rule gave us, and we are using it to dig the foundations of, to destroy the foundations of colonial rule. So that's a very, very pertinent observation, I think. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And a big thanks to Sachin, because I would not have been able to talk about my book had he not asked very important and probing questions. I can't ask him anything about anesthesia. So it's wonderful that he can ask me about history. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much once again, Devika ji and Dr. Sachin Sadawarte. Wonderfully moderated session. Thank you so much, audience, for participating. Before we end our session, may I request our patron, Shri Hemant Lodha ji, to present a token of love to our author, Devika Sethi. And also present a small token of love to our moderator, Dr. Sachin Sadawarte.